Maya Rodriguez had always believed that family heirlooms carried more than just sentimental value. They held pieces of souls, fragments of stories that refused to die. The silver cross around her neck had belonged to her grandmother Elena, who'd worn it through 60 years of marriage, 5 children, and countless prayers whispered in Spanish during the hardest times. When Maya's world crumbled 3 months ago, losing her job at the marketing firm and facing eviction from her downtown apartment, she'd clutched that cross like a lifeline. But lifelines, she discovered, sometimes break under too much weight. The estate auction house on Elm Street buzzed with the energy of vultures circling fresh carrion. Maya stood near the back, her heart hammering against her ribs as strangers pawed through the remnants of her grandmother's life. The antique furniture, the hand-embroidered quilts, the collection of ceramic angels, everything Elena Rodriguez had cherished was now reduced to lot numbers and starting bids. Maya had tried desperately to avoid this moment, calling every relative, seeking loans from friends, even considering payday advances that would have buried her deeper in debt. Nothing worked. The storage unit fees had gone unpaid for 4 months, and the facility's policy was merciless. Abandon your belongings, and they become someone else's treasure. Standing in that sterile room, surrounded by the musty smell of old furniture and the harsh fluorescent lighting that made everyone look sickly, Maya felt like she was attending her own funeral. Each item that went under the hammer took a piece of her history with it. The ornate mirror where she'd practiced her quinceañera dance moves sold for $12. The wooden rocking chair where Alina had nursed 3 generations of Bobbies went for 28. The leather-bound Bible, its pages yellow with age and marked with decades of notes in Alina's careful handwriting, barely fetched $15. Then came the jewelry box, a small mahogany treasure chest that Alina had kept on her dresser for as long as Maya could remember. Inside lay the silver cross, not particularly valuable by market standards, but priceless in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars. The auctioneer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the demeanor of someone who'd long ago stopped seeing the emotional weight of his work, held up the box with casual indifference. Next up, we have Lot 47, miscellaneous jewelry including silver pieces, costume jewelry, and religious items. Starting bid is $5. Maya's hand shot up instinctively, but her voice caught in her throat. $5. She had exactly $8.37 in her wallet, the remnants of her last unemployment check after paying for bus fare to get here. Around her, other bidders barely glanced at the jewelry box. To them, it was just another collection of old trinkets, the kind of items that filled countless estate sales across the country every weekend. But Maya could see the cross nestled among the other pieces, its familiar weight seeming to call out to her across the room. The bidding began sluggishly. $5, do I hear 5? The auctioneer called. Maya raised her hand, her palm already sweating. $5 to the young lady in the back. Do I hear 6? The competition was minimal. An elderly woman in the front row who seemed more interested in the vintage brooches, and a middle-aged man who Maya couldn't quite read. The silver cross had been Elena's confirmation gift, received when she was just 14 years old in a small church in San Antonio. Elena had told Maya the story countless times, how her own grandmother had saved for months to buy it, how it had been blessed by Father Miguel, and how it had never left Elena's neck except when she passed it down to Maya on her 18th birthday. Mija, Elena had said that day, her arthritic fingers struggling with the clasp. This cross has seen our family through wars, through poverty, through heartbreak and joy. It's not the silver that makes it precious. It's the love that's been wrapped around it for generations. Now that love was being auctioned off to the highest bidder, and Maya felt physically sick watching it happen. The bidding crept upward slowly. $6, 7, 8. When it hit $8, Maya's heart sank. She had 37 cents left, not enough to continue. The elderly woman nodded at $8.50, and Maya watched helplessly as her family's most treasured possession slipped away from her forever. $8.50, the auctioneer called. Going once, going twice. Maya closed her eyes, unable to watch the final blow fall. But then, unexpectedly, the room fell silent. She opened her eyes to see the auctioneer looking confused, his gavel suspended in midair. The elderly woman was shaking her head, apparently having changed her mind about the jewelry box. $8.50, going once more, the auctioneer tried again. Silence. Any other bids? The room remained still. Maya realized with growing hope that maybe, just maybe, she could afford this after all. But before she could raise her hand, a voice from the side of the room called out, $3. The number hung in the air like an insult. $3. For her grandmother's cross, for the jewelry box that had sat on Elena's dresser through decades of life's ups and downs, for pieces of her family's soul. Maya turned to see who had made the insulting bid and found herself looking at a man in an expensive suit, someone who clearly wasn't here out of necessity like she was. He looked like he was treating this as entertainment, a casual way to spend a Saturday morning picking up random curiosities. I have $3, the auctioneer announced, seemingly relieved to have any bid at all. Do I hear 4? Maya's hand trembled as she raised it, offering her last $4. The man in the suit glanced at her with mild annoyance and nodded to the auctioneer. $5. Maya's world tilted. She was out of money, out of options, out of hope. Around her, the auction continued its relentless pace, but all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. The cross, Elena's cross, her cross, was going to end up in the hands of someone who saw it as nothing more than a $3 trinket. $5, going once, going twice. The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through Maya's chest like a death knell. Sold to bidder number 43 for $5. Maya stood frozen as the man in the suit approached the payment table, pulling out a wallet thick with cash. He paid for the jewelry box with the same casual air he might use to buy a cup of coffee, tucking his receipt into his breast pocket without even opening the box to examine his purchase. For him, this was just another acquisition, another item to add to some collection or maybe even to flip for profit online. As the auction moved on to the next lot, Maya felt invisible tears sliding down her cheeks. She had come here hoping to at least witness the final chapter of her grandmother's legacy, maybe even to reclaim a small piece of it. Instead, she was leaving empty-handed, watching a stranger walk away with the last tangible connection she had to Elena Rodriguez. The man in the suit headed toward the exit, the small mahogany jewelry box tucked under his arm like an afterthought. Maya found herself following him, not really knowing what she planned to do or say, but unable to let the cross disappear from her life without at least trying one last desperate plea. Outside the auction house, the spring air felt sharp against her tear-stained cheeks. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The man turned, looking mildly irritated at being delayed. Up close, Maya could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, maybe in his early 30s, with the kind of confident bearing that came from never having to worry about money. "Yes," he asked, checking his expensive watch as if she were already taking up too much of his valuable time. Maya swallowed hard, trying to find words that wouldn't sound completely pathetic. "That jewelry box you just bought, there's a silver cross inside that belonged to my grandmother. I know this sounds crazy, but it means everything to me. Would you consider selling it back to me? I could pay you more than you paid, eventually. I just need some time to get the money together." The man's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked even more annoyed. "Sorry, but I bought it fair and square. It's mine now." He started to walk away, but Maya's desperation gave her courage she didn't know she possessed. "Please," she said, stepping into his path. "You don't understand. That cross has been in my family for generations. My grandmother wore it every day of her life. It's all I have left of her, and I never would have let it go if I'd had any other choice." The words tumbled out in a rush, her composure finally cracking completely. The man sighed with the exaggerated patience of someone dealing with an unreasonable child. "Look, lady, I get that you're upset, but business is business. You had the same chance to bid as everyone else. If it meant so much to you, you should have bid higher." His words were like ice water thrown in Maya's face, each syllable emphasizing just how little he understood or cared about her situation. "I couldn't bid higher," Maya whispered, her voice breaking. "I only had $8. I'm unemployed, I lost my apartment, and I had to sell everything just to survive. That cross is literally the last piece of my family I have left." For a moment, something flickered across the man's face. Maybe pity, maybe discomfort at being confronted with such raw desperation. But it passed quickly, replaced by the same cold indifference. "That's not my problem," he said flatly. "I'm not running a charity here. The auction was legitimate, the sale is final, and I don't owe you anything." He walked past her toward a gleaming black Mercedes parked at the curb, the jewelry box still tucked casually under his arm. Maya stood on the sidewalk, watching him drive away with the last piece of her grandmother's heart, feeling more alone and powerless than she ever had in her life. The unfairness of it burned in her chest like acid, that someone with so much money he could throw it away on random auction. Lots now owned something that meant nothing to him but everything to her. As she watched the Mercedes disappear around the corner, Maya made a promise to herself and to Alina's memory. Somehow, some way, she would get that cross back. She didn't know how yet, but she would find a way to make this right. The man in the expensive suit thought he'd won, thought his money gave him the right to take whatever he wanted without consequences. He was about to learn that some things were worth more than money, and that sometimes the people with the least to lose were the most dangerous to cross. Marcus Wellington, III, had been collecting antiques since college, though calling it collecting was generous. It was more like accumulating trophies from estate sales and auctions, items he could display in his downtown loft to impress dates and business associates. The mahogany jewelry box sat unopened on his dining room table for 3 days, forgotten among a dozen other purchases from that weekend's auction circuit. When he finally remembered to examine his haul, he opened the box with the same casual interest he might show while sorting through junk mail. The silver cross caught the light from his floor-to-ceiling windows, and for the first time since the auction, Marcus actually looked at what he'd bought. It was beautiful in a simple, understated way, clearly old, well-maintained, with intricate engravings that suggested it had been crafted by skilled hands. He lifted it from the box, surprised by its weight and the way it seemed to warm in his palm. For just a moment, he thought about the desperate young woman who'd confronted him outside the auction house, but he quickly pushed the memory aside. Sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford in business, and everything was business to Marcus Wellington III. He photographed the cross from several angles and posted it on his Instagram account, adding it to his growing collection of vintage finds. The post got the usual likes from his network of similarly privileged friends, people who treated antiquing like a competitive sport. Within an hour, he'd received 3 direct messages asking if the cross was for sale. Marcus smiled with satisfaction. He'd paid $5 and could probably get 50 or 60 for it from the right buyer. Meanwhile, Maya had spent those same 3 days walking the streets of downtown, searching for the black Mercedes and trying to figure out how to track down the man who'd bought her grandmother's cross. She'd called the auction house, but they claimed they couldn't release buyer information due to privacy policies. She'd haunted coffee shops and restaurants in the upscale part of town, hoping to spot him by chance. Her remaining $7 had gone to bus fare for these futile searches, leaving her surviving on free samples from grocery stores and the kindness of a few sympathetic shop owners who let her sit in their establishments to escape the spring rain. On Tuesday morning, Maya was sitting in a public library, using their free internet to search for estate sale companies and auction houses, when she stumbled across Marcus's Instagram account. She'd been looking through social media posts tagged with the auction house's name, hoping to find someone who might have information about the buyer. When she saw the photo of Elena's cross, her hands started shaking so violently she could barely control the mouse. The caption read, "Beautiful vintage religious piece from this weekend's estate sale. Amazing what treasures you can find for pocket change. Antiqua hunting vintage silver estate finds." The casual tone, the reduction of her family's most precious possession to a vintage piece found for pocket change, made Maya feel physically sick. But it also gave her something she'd been lacking for 3 days: hope. She now knew who had the cross, and more importantly, she could see exactly where he lived based on the background of his other photos. Marcus Wellington III lived in the Meridian Tower, one of the most expensive residential buildings in the city. Maya had cleaned office buildings in that neighborhood before losing her job, so she knew the area well. She also knew that places like the Meridian Tower had security systems designed to keep people like her out. But desperation breeds creativity, and Maya had 3 months of unemployment to teach her skills she'd never thought she'd need. She spent the rest of Tuesday observing the building's routines. The doorman changed shifts at 6 in the evening, and there was a 15-minute window during shift change when the front desk was temporarily unmanned. The building had a service entrance that was used by delivery drivers and cleaning crews, and Maya noticed that most of these workers were Hispanic women around her age. She also observed that residents routinely ignored the service workers, treating them as invisible fixtures of their privileged world. Wednesday morning, Maya used her last $3 to buy a white polo shirt from a thrift store and borrowed a cleaning cart from a sympathetic janitor at the library who understood what it meant to be desperate. At 5:45 that evening, she walked through the Meridian Tower's service entrance wearing the white shirt and pushing the cart, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, and her eyes cast downward in the universal posture of service industry invisibility. The elevator to the residential floors required a key card, but Maya had watched the cleaning crews long enough to know they often propped the service elevator door open while moving between floors. She waited in the service area until she heard the familiar ding of the elevator arriving, then slipped inside just as a legitimate cleaning woman was heading up to the 10th floor. Nuevo trabajo? The woman asked, assuming Maya was a new member of the cleaning crew. Maya replied, grateful for her grandmother's insistence that she maintain her Spanish. Temporary assignment. The woman nodded sympathetically and got off at the 10th floor, leaving Maya alone in the elevator. She'd memorized Marcus's apartment number from cross-referencing his address with the building directory she'd photographed earlier. 23rd floor, apartment 2314. As the elevator climbed, Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. She had no real plan beyond getting to his door, no idea what she would say or do once she got there. The 23rd floor was hushed with the kind of expensive quiet that money could buy. Thick carpeting muffled her footsteps as she made her way down the hallway, passing doors that probably cost more than most people's cars. Apartment 2314 was at the end of the hall, its door identical to all the others, except for the small bronze numbers that marked it as her destination. Maya stood outside Marcus's door for a full minute, gathering courage she wasn't sure she possessed. Through the door, she could hear the faint sound of jazz music and what sounded like a dinner party in progress. Voices, laughter, the clink of expensive glasses. Marcus was entertaining, probably showing off his latest acquisitions to friends who had more money than sense. She knocked softly at first, then with more confidence when no one answered. The music inside grew quieter, and she heard footsteps approaching the door. When it opened, Marcus stood there holding a glass of wine, his face shifting from mild annoyance to recognition to something approaching alarm. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded, glancing nervously back toward his apartment where his guests were waiting. "I came for my grandmother's cross," Maya said quietly, surprised by her own calm. "I'm not leaving without it." Marcus's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Behind him, Maya could see the edge of his living room, where well-dressed people were examining various antiques and collectibles arranged on side tables and shelves. Her grandmother's cross was probably sitting among them, being admired by people who saw it as nothing more than a conversation piece. "I told you at the auction," Marcus began, but Maya cut him off. "I know what you told me, but I also know what's right, and keeping something that means nothing to you while it means everything to me isn't right. I'm not asking you to give it to me for free. I'll pay you whatever you want as soon as I can get the money. I just need you to hold on to it until then." Marcus glanced over his shoulder again, clearly concerned about his guests overhearing this conversation. The last thing he wanted was for his social circle to witness him being confronted by someone who looked like she'd been living on the streets, which, Maya realized, wasn't far from the truth. "Look," he said in a low voice, "I don't know how you found out where I live, but this is harassment. I'm going to call security if you don't leave right now." Maya felt something inside her snap. 3 months of unemployment, losing her apartment, watching her grandmother's belongings get auctioned off to strangers, and now being threatened by someone who had everything while she had nothing. It was too much. "Go ahead and call security," she said, raising her voice just enough that his guests might hear. "Call them and explain how you bought a dying woman's cross for $3 and won't even consider selling it back to her granddaughter who's homeless and desperate." Marcus's face went white. Through the open door, Maya could see that his guests had stopped talking and were starting to look toward the entryway with curiosity. In his world, image was everything, and Maya had just threatened the carefully cultivated persona he'd spent years building. "5 minutes," he said quickly, stepping out into the hallway and pulling the door closed behind him. "We talk for 5 minutes, and then you leave and never come back here again." Maya nodded, knowing she'd won this small battle even if the war was far from over. "I don't want to cause you trouble with your friends," she said, though they both knew that was exactly what she was prepared to do if necessary. "I just want what belongs to my family." Marcus ran his hand through his perfectly styled hair, clearly struggling between his desire to maintain his image and his anger at being cornered in his own home. "The cross is already promised to someone else," he said finally. "I have a buyer lined up, someone who collects religious antiques. The deal is practically done." Maya felt her heart sink, but she forced herself to stay calm. "How much is he paying you?" $60, Marcus admitted, probably hoping the amount would discourage her. "I can get you $60, Maya lied, having no idea how she would possibly come up with that much money. "Just give me a week." Marcus shook his head. "It's not about the money, it's about principle. I bought it legally, it's mine to sell, and I've already made a commitment to another buyer. I can't just back out of a deal because you showed up here making demands." Maya stared at him for a long moment, seeing not just Marcus Wellington III, but everything he represented. A world where money mattered more than meaning, where privilege protected people from having to consider the consequences of their actions, where the desires of the wealthy automatically trumped the desperation of the poor. "You're right," she said finally. "You did buy it legally, and you do have the right to sell it to whoever you want. But just because you can do something doesn't mean you should." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "That cross has been in my family for 4 generations. It was my great-great-grandmother's confirmation gift, and it's been worn by every woman in my family since then. It's seen us through wars, through poverty, through immigration, through heartbreak and joy. It's not just jewelry to us. It's our history, our connection to each other, our faith." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting this conversation to end, but unable to simply walk away now that she was making it personal. My grandmother, Elena, wore that cross every single day for 60 years, Maya continued. When she was dying, she took it off and put it around my neck herself. She told me it would protect me, that it would remind me that I was never truly alone as long as I carried my family's love with me. I only sold her things because I was about to be homeless, because I had no other choice. If I'd had any other option, any other way to survive, I never would have let it go. That's a very touching story, Marcus said, his voice tight with discomfort. But it doesn't change the facts. I'm sorry for your situation, but I can't solve everyone's problems. Maya nodded slowly, finally understanding that Marcus Wellington III was exactly who she'd thought he was, someone who had so much that he couldn't even comprehend what it meant to have nothing, someone who confused having rights with being right. "You're absolutely correct," she said. "You can't solve everyone's problems, but you could solve this one easily, and you're choosing not to. That says something about who you are as a person." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Don't try to guilt-trip me. I don't owe you anything." "No," Maya agreed. "You don't owe me anything, but you owe yourself the chance to be better than this." She turned to go, then looked back at him one more time. "I hope whoever buys my grandmother's cross appreciates what they're getting. Not the silver that's not worth much, but the love that's been wrapped around it for generations. That's priceless, even if you can't see it." As Maya walked back toward the elevator, she heard Marcus's apartment door close behind her with a soft click. She'd failed to get the cross back, but she'd accomplished something else entirely. She'd planted a seed of doubt in Marcus Wellington III's perfectly ordered world. Whether that seed would grow into something resembling a conscience remained to be seen. Maya spent that night on a bench in a downtown park, wrapped in the thin jacket that had become her only protection against the spring chill. She'd used the last of her money on the thrift store shirt and bus fare, leaving her with no resources and fewer options than ever. But as she stared up at the stars barely visible through the city's light pollution, she found herself thinking not about her failures, but about Elena's stories of surviving much worse circumstances with nothing but faith and determination. Elena had immigrated to America with nothing but the clothes on her back and the cross around her neck. She'd worked in factories, cleaned houses, raised 5 children while her husband worked double shifts, and somehow managed to build a life worth living through sheer force of will and an unshakable belief that tomorrow could be better than today. If Elena could do all that, Maya reasoned, surely she could find a way to reclaim one silver cross from one privileged man who didn't even want it for the right reasons. The next morning, Maya made her way back to the library and spent hours researching Marcus Wellington III. What she found was a pattern of behavior that painted him as exactly the kind of person she'd suspected. Someone who took what he wanted without considering the cost to others. Someone who treated the world as his personal shopping mall. Someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions, because his family's money had always protected him from accountability. Marcus Wellington III was the son of Marcus Wellington Jr., who was himself the son of the original Marcus Wellington, founder of Wellington Properties, one of the city's largest real estate development companies. The family had a history of buying up low-income neighborhoods, displacing long-time residents in favor of luxury developments, and fighting any attempts at affordable housing requirements. They were, Maya realized, part of the reason people like her ended up homeless in the first place. But the most interesting thing Maya discovered was that the Wellington family took their public image very seriously. They donated heavily to charities, sponsored art exhibitions, and made sure their names appeared on plaques in museums and hospitals throughout the city. Marcus III served on the boards of several nonprofit organizations and was frequently photographed at fundraising galas for causes related to poverty and homelessness. The ultimate irony given his treatment of Maya. Maya had stumbled onto something more valuable than money: leverage. Marcus Wellington III couldn't afford to have his reputation tarnished, especially not by a story that would make him look heartless and hypocritical. The question was how to use this leverage without crossing lines that would make her as bad as him. She started by creating a simple blog post telling her story, not mentioning Marcus by name, but describing the situation in enough detail that anyone who knew him would recognize the circumstances. She titled it, "When $3 Breaks Your Heart," a story about what we value, and she wrote it with all the raw emotion she'd been carrying since the auction. The post went viral within hours, shared by people who recognized the universal unfairness of watching the wealthy take what little the poor had left. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people shared their own stories of losing precious family heirlooms to economic necessity, of watching strangers treat their most meaningful possessions as casual curiosities. Many offered to donate money to help Maya buy back the cross, but she declined. This wasn't about crowdfunding a solution. It was about making a point about human decency and the responsibility that came with privilege. What Maya didn't expect was how quickly the story would be picked up by local news outlets. Within a week, she was fielding calls from reporters who wanted to interview her about the broader issues of poverty and dignity, about what happened when people were forced to sell their most precious possessions just to survive. The story resonated because it was both deeply personal and universally relevant. Everyone had something they would never want to lose, and everyone could imagine how it would feel to watch a stranger treat that precious thing as worthless. Marcus Wellington III watched this media attention with growing alarm. Although Maya had kept her promise not to mention him by name, people in his social circle were starting to ask questions. The timeline matched, the circumstances were identical, and several people remembered seeing him at estate auctions around the time Maya described. His carefully cultivated image as a philanthropist and community leader was starting to crack under the weight of whispered speculation about whether he was the unnamed villain in Maya's story. The breaking point came when Maya was invited to speak at a community forum about poverty and dignity, hosted by one of the nonprofit organizations where Marcus served on the board. She still didn't name him directly, but she spoke eloquently about the disconnect between charity as a social obligation and compassion as a human choice, about how it was possible to write checks to help the poor while simultaneously treating poor individuals with contempt and indifference. "The person who bought my grandmother's cross isn't evil," Maya told the packed auditorium, her voice carrying the hard-earned wisdom of someone who'd learned to survive with nothing. "They're just someone who's never had to choose between dignity and survival, someone who's never had to watch their family's history get auctioned off to the highest bidder. But that doesn't excuse the choice to value legal rights over human compassion, to prioritize personal collecting over another person's pain." Marcus was sitting in the back row, having attended the forum as part of his board responsibilities, and Maya's words hit him like physical blows. Around him, he could feel other board members shifting uncomfortably, could sense the sidelong glances and whispered conversations that would follow him home. His mother, who'd built the family's charitable reputation through decades of careful public relations, would be devastated if this scandal reflected badly on the Wellington name. After the forum, Marcus found himself waiting by Maya's car, a battered sedan that looked like it might not survive another winter. She emerged from the building surrounded by supporters and reporters, but when she saw him standing there, she quietly asked everyone to give her a few minutes alone. "Impressive speech," Marcus said when they were out of earshot from the others. His voice was tight with controlled anger, but underneath Maya could hear something else: uncertainty, maybe even doubt. "I meant every word of it," Maya replied calmly. "But I notice you're here, which means maybe some of it got through to you." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "You're destroying my reputation over a piece of jewelry worth maybe $20. "I'm not destroying anything," Maya corrected. "I'm just telling the truth about what happened. If that damages your reputation, maybe the problem isn't with my story. Maybe it's with your actions." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Finally, Marcus spoke again, his voice quieter now. "What do you want from me?" Maya looked at him for a long moment, seeing not just the man who'd bought her grandmother's cross, but someone who was finally beginning to understand that his choices had consequences beyond his own immediate desires. "I want you to do the right thing," she said simply. "Not because you have to, not because it's good for your image, but because it's right." "And if I don't?" Maya shrugged. "Then you don't. I can't force you to be a better person, Marcus. I can only give you the chance to choose to be one. Marcus Wellington III spent that night staring at Elena's cross, which sat on his coffee table next to a check for $60 from the collector who was supposed to buy it. For the first time since the auction, he really looked at the cross, not as an acquisition or an investment, but as the sacred object Maya had described. Under his living room's expensive lighting, he could see details he'd missed before. Tiny scratches that spoke of decades of wear, places where the silver had been polished smooth by loving hands, initials carved so small they were almost invisible but clearly added by someone who'd wanted to mark this piece as belonging to their family forever. For the first time in his privileged life, Marcus Wellington III was forced to confront the difference between what he had the right to do and what he should do. He'd bought the cross legally, but Maya's story had shown him that legality and morality weren't always the same thing. He could keep the cross, sell it to his collector, and move on with his life, but doing so would make him exactly the kind of person Maya had described, someone who confused having power with being right. The next morning, Marcus called Maya's number, which he'd gotten from a mutual acquaintance at the nonprofit. When she answered, her voice was cautious but not hostile. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, the words coming harder than he'd expected. "About doing the right thing." And Marcus took a deep breath. "I want to return your grandmother's cross, not sell it back to you, return it. It should never have been separated from your family in the first place." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Marcus wondered if the call had been dropped. Finally, Maya spoke, her voice thick with tears she was trying not to shed. "Why?" "Because you were right," Marcus admitted. "I don't need it, I don't deserve it, and keeping it would make me someone I don't want to be." He paused, then added, "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that." They met that afternoon at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where both of them could feel safe. Marcus brought the cross in its original mahogany box, and when he placed it on the table between them, Maya's hands shook as she reached for it. The moment her fingers touched the familiar silver, she began to cry, not the bitter tears she'd shed at the auction, but the cleansing tears of someone who'd believed in justice even when it seemed impossible. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the cross against her chest. "You have no idea what this means to me." Marcus watched her reaction and felt something he'd never experienced before. The deep satisfaction that came from doing something purely because it was right, not because it benefited him or improved his image or added to his collection. For the first time in his life, he understood what his mother had been trying to teach him about the responsibility that came with privilege. "I canceled the sale to the collector," he said. "Told him the piece wasn't actually available after all." Maya looked up at him through her tears. What made you change your mind? Marcus considered the question seriously. You did. The way you talked about your grandmother, about what the cross meant to your family, about love being wrapped around it for generations. I realized I was about to sell something priceless to someone who would just see it as another addition to his collection. That felt wrong in a way I'd never really thought about before. Maya fastened the cross around her neck with hands that trembled with emotion. The familiar weight of it against her chest felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. My grandmother used to say that sometimes we have to lose something precious to understand how precious it really is. I think maybe that's true for both of us. Marcus nodded, understanding that Maya wasn't just talking about the cross. I've been thinking about that speech you gave, about the difference between charity and compassion. I write checks to organizations that help homeless people, but I'd never actually talked to someone experiencing homelessness until I met you. I'd never thought about what it actually feels like to have to sell your family's history just to survive. Most people don't, Maya said gently. It's easier to write a check than to look at the face of poverty and understand that it could happen to anyone. They talked for another hour, two people from completely different worlds finding common ground in the recognition that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of their circumstances. When they finally parted ways, Marcus felt like he was seeing his city, his life, and his responsibilities with new eyes. Maya Rodriguez walked home that day with Alina's cross around her neck, and something she'd thought she'd lost forever: hope. Not just hope that she would find work and get back on her feet financially, but hope that people could change, that privilege could be tempered with compassion, and that sometimes the right thing happened even when it seemed impossible. The story of the cross and its return spread through social media and local news outlets, but this time the focus was different. Instead of highlighting the original injustice, people celebrated the redemption, the proof that conscience could triumph over convenience, that empathy could bridge the gap between different worlds. People's losses. The jewelry box that had held Alina's cross remained on his coffee table, but now it was empty except for a handwritten note from Maya thanking him for his change of heart. It served as a daily reminder that some things were worth more than their market value. Maya used the story of recovering her grandmother's cross as a springboard for advocacy work, speaking at community events about the hidden costs of poverty and the importance of treating everyone with dignity regardless of their circumstances. She eventually found work with a nonprofit organization that helped families in crisis avoid having to sell precious belongings. And she often told Alina's story as an example of how material objects could carry immaterial value that no price tag could capture. Marcus and Maya maintained a friendship that surprised both of them, built on mutual respect and the shared understanding that people were capable of growth and change. Marcus began using his family's resources more thoughtfully, focusing on programs that addressed root causes of poverty rather than just its symptoms. He learned to see past the surface of situations to understand the human stories beneath, and he discovered that listening to people like Maya taught him more about the world than any college course ever had. The cross never left Maya's neck again. She wore it through job interviews and first days at work, through the gradual process of rebuilding her life and finding stable housing. She wore it when she met the man who would become her husband, when she walked down the aisle at their wedding, and when she held her first child in her arms. And she planned to wear it until the day she could pass it on to the next generation, along with the story of how it was lost and found, and what that taught her about the power of persistence and the possibility of redemption. Elena Rodriguez had been right about many things, but perhaps most of all about this. The cross did protect Maya, not through any supernatural power, but through the strength that came from knowing she was connected to something larger than herself. It reminded her that she carried not just her own hopes and dreams, but the accumulated wisdom and love of all the women who had worn it before her. And now it carried an additional story, proof that sometimes, if you fight for what matters most, the universe finds a way to give it back to you. The silver cross that had been sold for $3 and almost lost forever became a symbol of something much more valuable. The idea that everyone deserves to be treated with compassion, that privilege comes with responsibility, that people can change for the better, and that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that restore not just objects, but faith in human decency. Years later, when Maya's daughter asked about the cross and why it was so important to their family, Maya would tell her the whole story about Elena's immigration and strength, about losing everything and finding hope, about a man who learned to choose compassion over convenience. She would explain that the cross was precious not because of its silver content, but because it represented the unbreakable connections between generations, the power of standing up for what you believe in, and the possibility that even in the darkest moments, kindness could still triumph over indifference. The cross would continue its journey through Maya's family, carrying with it not just the original story of faith and immigration, but the new chapter about loss and recovery, about the meeting of two different worlds, and about the transformation that was possible when people chose to see each other as human beings deserving of respect and compassion. It had become more than a family heirloom. It was a testament to the idea that sometimes the most important things in life couldn't be bought or sold, only shared, protected, and passed on with love. Marcus Wellington III would go on to become one of the city's most thoughtful philanthropists, but he would always credit Maya Rodriguez and her grandmother's cross with teaching him the difference between charity and justice, between giving money and giving of oneself. The empty jewelry box on his coffee table served as a constant reminder of the day he chose to be better than he had to be, and the unexpected friendship that had grown from that choice. And Elena Rodriguez, whose cross had traveled such an unlikely path from her granddaughter's neck to an auction house to a stranger's collection and back again, would have been pleased to know that her most treasured possession had done more than just survive. It had taught two very different people about the things that truly mattered, and in doing so, had created a story worth telling for generations to come. The cross had been sold for $3, but its real value, the love, the faith, the connections it represented, and the lessons it taught, was truly priceless. And that perhaps was the most important lesson of all, that the things we treasure most cannot be measured in dollars and cents, but in the depth of meaning they carry and the lives they touch along the way. In the end, Maya Rodriguez and Marcus Wellington III had both learned something invaluable from their encounter with Elena's cross. Maya learned that even in the darkest moments, persistence and faith could lead to unexpected victories. Marcus learned that true wealth came not from what you could acquire, but from what you chose to give back. And both learned that sometimes the most important connections happen between people who seem to have nothing in common except their shared humanity. The silver cross continued to catch the light as it had for generations, but now it carried within its modest gleam the reflection of a story about second chances, about the power of standing up for what you believe in, and about the extraordinary things that could happen when ordinary people chose to do the right thing, even when no one was watching. It was, as Elena had always said, a cross that had seen their family through everything, and now it had seen them through one more trial, one more test of faith, one more opportunity to prove that love and justice could triumph over indifference and greed. Years would pass, and the details of the auction and the confrontation would fade into family legend, but the lesson would remain, that some things were worth fighting for, that people could change, and that sometimes the most powerful victories came not from defeating your enemies, but from transforming them into friends. The cross would be passed down through Maya's family with its story intact, a silver testament to the idea that in a world that often seemed harsh and unfair, compassion and justice could still prevail, sometimes in the most unexpected ways, and sometimes through the most unlikely people. Maya Rodriguez had recovered more than just her grandmother's cross. She had recovered her faith in the possibility that the world could be better than it was, one person and one choice at a time. And Marcus Wellington III had discovered something he never knew he was missing, the deep satisfaction that came from using his privilege to lift others up rather than simply to accumulate more for himself. Together, They had created a story that would inspire others to believe in the power of doing the right thing, even when it seemed impossible, even when it cost them something, even when no one would ever know. The cross that had been sold at auction for $3 had become the foundation for a friendship worth millions, a catalyst for personal transformation that would ripple through generations, and a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever lost something precious and wondered if they would ever get it back. Sometimes, Maya would realize the things we lose are meant to find their way back to us, carrying with them lessons we never could have learned any other way. And in the end, that was Elena Rodriguez's greatest gift to her granddaughter, not just the cross itself, but the story it would generate, the lives it would touch, and the proof it would provide that even in the darkest moments, love could find a way to triumph over loss, compassion could overcome indifference, and hope could survive even the most impossible circumstances. The cross had been sold for $3, but its true value was immeasurable, and its story would continue to inspire long after Maya herself had passed it on to the next generation, along with the lesson that the most precious things in life were not things at all, but the connections between people, the courage to stand up for what was right, and the faith that tomorrow could always be better than today.